All right, everyone, we're going to get started. I know people are still coming into the room, but we got a full day here. First of all, welcome to everyone. I have to say I'm really excited about this webinar event we're going to have. This webinar event, just so you know, was actually initiated by Galves. He was the one who came forward with the idea of looking at Soteria past, present, and future. And I think one of the key elements here is we're going to hear a lot of discussion also about Soteria first formed in 1970, the first one, but of Soterias that are operating today and beginning to come to life. So I think this is going to be a very optimistic hour and a half we have. I have to, real quickly, my own interest in Soteria originated when I was writing Mad in America more than 20 years ago. And what I was particularly interested in was, at that time, the experiment was started by Loren Mosher, who was head of schizophrenia studies. And he ran it as an experiment that compared Soteria care, where people would be coming into an emergency room and then they'd be either randomized to a hospital setting or to this residential setting. And it was meant to see if an alternative to hospital and drug-centered care, how would it do? And minimal use of antipsychotics. And reason it was so important to me and when I was writing Mad in America is they reported better outcomes. I'll talk more about this in a second. So it was designed as an alternative, and I was quite interested because the alternative involved sort of selective use of antipsychotics. So I'm really excited and today we have people who are very much intimately involved with Soteria's past, present, and future. So here's our panelists. Al Galves is a psychologist in Las Cruces, New Mexico. As I said, he was the one who came to Mad in America and said, let's do a webinar on this event. And he was the one who put together the panel. He's a past president of MindFreedom International and a past executive director of the International Society for Ethical Psychology and Psychiatry. He is also a part of a group that has been seeking to create a Soteria project, Soteria House in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and I think he has some exciting news about that possibility and what's happening there. Now, Gene Larkin, he was a member. He started working in the original Soteria project in 1971. In 1972, he left that Soteria project to help start Diapasis, which was a Jungian-based residential treatment program in San Francisco, which I believe also involved minimal or selective use of antipsychotics. He then returned when a second Soteria house was opened up in 1973, I believe, Emanon, which was designed to show that the original Soteria house could be replicated. And I believe those two Soteria houses ran for 12 years, 1983. Is that correct, Gene?
Yes. I mean, Soteria went longer. Emanon closed maybe about 3 years earlier.
Okay. Next, we have Susan Musante, who just disappeared from my screen, but there you are, Susan. And she was the founding director of Soteria Alaska, which I believe was started in, you said 2009 and ran to 2016. She also was full-time director of Choices in Alaska, which was a peer empowerment organization that was sort of affiliated with the Soteria House. Is that correct, Susan?
Yes, they were like companion programs. So Soteria was the alternative to inpatient hospitalization, and the peer-run Choices was the alternative to the regular community mental health center.
Oh, fantastic. And Susan is also involved with Al in creating the Soteria project in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And Katie is from Vermont.
Can you use earphones?
Katie has been working at the Soteria House in Vermont, which opened up in 2016, right? Do I have this right, Katie?
2015, and then I joined in 2016.
2016. Yeah. And so it's still operating, Soteria Vermont. She's also the director of the Rosewood Cottage Peer Respite in Vermont, which opened this past fall. So those are our panelists. So you can see we have people with a lot of experience with Soteria settings and also now involved in creating a new Soteria house. And I just want to say one final thing. What's great about this is we're seeing these alternatives spring to life now in this time. In Israel, for example, there's a number of Soteria houses. So one of the things I hope this webinar will do, it will be inspiring to people to think about how we can help promote this sort of alternative form of care. All right, Al, we're going to turn it over to you. Oh, sorry, I got to say a little bit more. Sorry. Here's how this webinar is going to work. Al's going to give a talk. And then after this, like I said, we're going to have a discussion among everybody. It's going to be a free-willing discussion. What you can do to sort of give questions to the panelists is you can you put a question in the Q&A box. You can also upvote the questions you really like there. And Zoe will send those questions to me, and I'll try to interject those questions into the ongoing discussion. James Moore is also going to look at, is there themes emerging in the chat that also would be interesting to give to the panelists, and send me notices as well. The point is, this discussion is going to happen, but we're not going to stop for just a Q&A. We're going to try to interject your questions into this ongoing discussion. Maybe that's going to be about 50 minutes. Then we're going to have time for a 10-minute movie about Soteria Vermont. Then we'll come back. We'll talk a little bit about about how to go about starting Soterias. And that's how this day's going to go. So now, Al, over to you.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for that introduction, those introductions. So what I'll do is basically describe the Soteria model and something about the history of it and something about my interest in it. So basically, Soteria is a home-like residence. The one in Vermont is 5 beds. The original one was 6 beds. Vermont is now going to go to 8 beds. We're thinking in Las Cruces about 8 beds. So home-like residence, hopefully with a big kitchen, because as in many families, a lot goes on in the kitchen. A large living room, maybe community room, backyard. So a residence, basically. And when people who are experiencing psychosis come to Soteria, the message they get is, come on in, you can stay here as long as you want. We're going to help you go through this experience. We're going to provide you with safety, support, and affirmation as you go through this experience. Because even though it may be impairing, and it may be scary and agitating and troubling, somehow it's how you're surviving. It's how you're moving through the world in your way. This is how you're surviving and moving towards healing and recovery, if you want to use that model. So we're going to help you do that. And typically in Soteria houses, people stabilize within 6 to 8 weeks. And once they're more stable, maybe less agitated, they're helped and encouraged to go out into the community. Take a class, volunteer work, maybe supported employment, go to a support group, go to therapy, go to church, art, recreation, getting back into their lives and into the community. So all of the Soterias I know of have been directed by a licensed clinician. And all of the Soterias I know of have also had a contract with a psychiatrist. So medication is available, but it's not the first modality of treatment. It's not the main modality of treatment, and it's on a voluntary basis. The main modality of treatment really is relationship. And most of the Soteria houses that I know of have been staffed by non-credentialed people who are able to be with people in a psychotic experience and receive some training and are able to help people go through crises that always occur in Soteria houses. It sounds wonderful, you know, we're going to provide you with safety, support, and affirmation. But as you'll hear, all kinds of crazy, weird things happen, and scary things often in Soteria houses. But the staff is trained to not call 911, to help people calm down, to help people go through crises. So basically, that's the way the model works. Now, Bob told you a little bit about the first Soteria house, which was a project of the National Institute of Mental Health. It was the brainchild of Lauren Mosier, a psychiatrist who was the head of the schizophrenia research project at the NIMH. And as a research project, a very good study was done. Patients were randomly, by the way, the original Soteria was designed for people in first episode, for young people in first episode. That's no longer the case. The one in Vermont, the one in Alaska, basically people came in who already had been on the medication, who had been treated in other ways. But the first one was for people in first episode. So patients were randomly assigned to Soteria or to the hospital for conventional treatment. 2 years after treatment had ended, the researchers went out and interviewed people. And what they found was that the people treated at Soteria were doing significantly better than the people treated at the hospital in terms of social functioning, where they were living, who they were living with, in terms of employment, more of them employed, in terms of symptoms, less symptoms, and less rehospitalizations. So it was effective. It was an effective approach to treating psychosis. But even though it was effective, and a good study was done for evidence, instead of replicating it, seeing maybe trying other versions out, trying larger numbers, maybe even a hospital milieu, the NIMH shut it down. They fired Lauren Mosier, and they buried the data. Now, the reason I know they buried the data is because I met with the woman in charge of schizophrenia research at NIMH in 2010. And I asked her, have you ever heard of the Soteria Project? She had never heard of it, even though it's in the NIMH archives. She never heard of it. So in a way, you can look on this as a landmark or a watershed moment in the history of American psychiatry, because you had a psychosocial treatment that was more effective than conventional treatment and totally shut down, and the data buried. So I just want to tell you a little bit about why I got so excited about Soteria. So I'm studying psychology. I'm going to be a psychotherapist. And of course, I'm very interested in psychosis because it's the most serious, quote unquote, mental illness. The symptoms are bizarre and troubling. And what are we going to do about this? Hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking. And I knew you could do psychotherapy, but I also knew that took a long time. Typically, psychotherapy, you're talking about 2, 3 years, 4 years. And, I'm thinking that, wow, maybe there's something I can say to a person in a session that would make a difference. Maybe I can say the right words or some interpretation or something like that. But really, I don't think so. And then I learned about Soteria, and it just hit me between the eyes. Yes, this is the way to do it. What these people really need, what people in this experience having this need, is safety. They need safety, support, and affirmation in a place where they can live. And it just struck me as this is the way to do it. This is the way. It's very low tech, and it's not hugely scientific, but this is what's going to work. Just made all the sense in the world, because that kind of a residence, the way Soteria works, is providing people with exactly what they need, because it turns out that the majority of people who experience psychosis have been hurt. They've been discounted, put down, dishonored, rejected, made to feel inadequate, abused in various ways. And they just are not up to living in this world with these people, in a toxic world with toxic human beings. So this is what they need. And it just hit me between the eyes, say, yes, this is what we have to do. So with that, I'm going to open it up to our panelists, all of whom have worked in Soteria houses and managed Soteria houses. So yes, welcome, Jean, Susan, and Katie. And I'll just open it up to you guys, and you can tell stories, talk about your experiences, give people a flavor of how this works and why it works and what goes on in Soteria houses.
Okay, so I'll start, if it's okay with you guys, just about the original Soteria house. I got there via reading an article in Atlantic Monthly on Kingsley Hall, where it mentioned at the very end that they were going to open a similar program somewhere in the Bay Area. And I spent the next 8 months trying to find it. What what I think was unique at the time, I guess what I have to say is, well, I'm going to talk about just what was going on at the original Soteria House. Because these programs are so different, each one is unique and individual. So what I'm saying will not apply to what Al says at his place, Katie at her place. It may apply, it may not. It doesn't really matter because they're all individual programs. And the underlying premise of it all is the term mental illness. And I think that term in itself states that the individual themselves has something broken and wrong with them, something seriously wrong that needs to be fixed before they can be accepted as a valuable human being. And Soteria doesn't argue against that. It wasn't Thomas Zazz's The Myth of Mental Illness. It simply said that the individual has the right to make that decision. The individual can say whether or not they're broken. And we at the house, you can agree with it or disagree with it. We're going to value them regardless. And the whole point of the original Soteria House was because it was phenomenological, was that the relationship is what mattered more than anything else. The causality of what brought the crisis wasn't important. It was important, but it wasn't the focus. Resolving the crisis was not the focus. The causality was not the focus. The only focus always was the individual, establishing a relationship with the individual. And that's where the value came from there on in. Therapy was never, ever done. You just didn't do it. You just had conversations. If it came up in the conversation, that's fine. You could talk about whatever you wanted, Freudian, Jungian, whoever else, Gestalt, but it was never done to anybody. You didn't do therapy. You didn't interpret anything for anybody. If they wanted to interpret it, then that's fine. You just listened to them and had conversations with them. But it all was based on the establishment of a trusting relationship. And I think that took the place of medications. That's what allowed people to experience their crises, whether they were considered evil, the devil, they were God, they were no good, they were super good. It didn't matter. You just valued them for who they were, period. And that was the whole underlying theme of it all. So that was kind of what set it up. And from that, and it always was relationships. So I'm good with that for the time being. So go ahead, Susan or Katie.
So I would say that Soteria Alaska was very much aligned with what Jean has said, but it was a different time and the world is different and funding was different, and that always shapes it. But one of the points I wanted to make is that when we were running Soteria Alaska, we didn't really think of people as sick or mentally ill. They were like going through some kind of transformation process. And sometimes they used a language that we didn't really understand all the time. They'd be speaking of things we didn't always understand. And so we started to view it as like a language. Like, you just said this, can you say it? One of my favorite lines that someone taught me is, could you say this in a way that I can understand it? Because I don't really speak that specific language. It was kind of like that. But the other point I really want to make is that the house is about relationships, and there's not the usual medical model of boundaries between staff and residents who live there. And even though it was not a peer-run model, many of the people who worked there also had their own personal experiences, and they can tell you they transformed as well. And if we have time later, I can pull up a letter somebody wrote. But it essentially, yes, they were there to help people, but in reality, they were being helped and transformed in their own way. And this happened, as Al said, a lot of times in the kitchen, because stuff happened around the fireplace and in the kitchen. But the actual experience is like something I've never experienced before or even since. And I happen to be in Alaska at the moment, and I was able to have dinner with one of my old house managers from Soteria. So that was like a gift to me, and we always muse about how it worked. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you all. I'm traveling and I'm in a little bit of an unstable internet environment. I've already lost you once. So if I go out, it's only because I can't help it.
I'm Katie Borg, and I use she, her pronouns, and I've been at Pathways Vermont Soteria program for almost since its inception, and then I took a 1-year hiatus, but have otherwise been involved. And I'm seeing some of the questions in the chat, so I think I'll just give you just a general framing of like how it's currently functioning. So we are licensed in the state of Vermont through DALE, which is the Department of Aging and Independent Living, as a therapeutic community residence. And then we're fully funded by the Department of Mental Health every year. So kind of how Soteria came to be in Vermont is that we had a major flood in Waterbury, and it shut down the state hospital. So at that time, people kind of came together and they were like, what can we do differently in Vermont? And that is what prompted legislative action to actually get Soteria written into the legislature and created for us to be like fully funded every year. So I'm trying to think of what else to tell you that feels like there's so much important to tell you all in the midst of this. So we're currently a 5-bed residence, and we're moving to be an 8-bed residence, hopefully next year, which is really exciting for us. We were able to raise about $2 million to create our new Soteria house. So we're completely renovating it. It's a super exciting project. Hope to serve 8 people. And right now, in terms of funding, one of the problems that we've had is that we're not able to use the funding that comes in to buy a house. We weren't able to put a down payment on a building, so we had to fundraise in order to get a new building, which was a really big deal for us. We've been paying rent since we opened. So that's a pretty big distinction and something we're really excited about in terms of the stability of the program ongoing. And yeah, I think I'll probably stop talking now and like open it up for more questions and respond as it makes sense to.
So, Katie, I always think of Soteria Vermont as like an act of God or the universe.
Yeah.
Because if that flood hadn't happened, there wouldn't probably be a Soteria Vermont. So I just always think it was just supposed to be. So
yeah.
Congratulations on
I'd like to add something about that also. There was another wonderful thing that happened in Vermont, and that is that the director of mental health in Vermont had read Anatomy of an Epidemic. Somehow or other, who knows why he read it, but he read Anatomy of an Epidemic, and he went to hear Robert Whitaker talk. And that's very important, because he then was open to having a different understanding about psychosis, about how to help people in a psychotic experience, very different from the conventional treatment approach. And I think that was a big step. So I got to tell you, one of the things I did was send the director of behavioral health in New Mexico a copy of Anatomy of an Epidemic and ask him to read it.
And I could also add that the reason there was a Soteria Alaska was because Jim Godstein also read your book, Bob, and he just kind of was like, we could do this differently, and went down that road.
So, of course, it's quite rewarding to hear these stories. But one of the things I think the point is that with all these is that it is an evidence-based thing to do. You can make the case it's evidence-based, it's better outcomes. And that's the language of the conventional mental health system. So even in their language and by their own measurement of outcomes, you can say this is a better way to do things. And I think that is important if you're trying to start something. I will say also the houses that got started in Israel, the same case was made, and I went over a number of times to make this case, and I think that's really key. I'd like to, and there's a lot of great questions about replication. Why aren't we seeing more? We can get to these. But I want to play devil's advocate here for a second, because, there's a lot of resistance to Soteria out there. And the first thing is, oh, you guys are not really getting psychotic patients. You're not getting the really difficult patients or people coming in. And can you just address to like how, and then they'll say like, oh, we need hospitals to handle, we need forced treatment, we need to handle the difficult patients, and that's not what you're seeing at the Soteria houses. Can you respond to the sense of what sort of patients do you see, and how do you respond to people in crisis, and without forcing treatment on them if they don't want medication treatment?
So I can tell you at Soteria, Alaska, the people who came to our house were what most of the world would call very psychotic. And we didn't talk about this, I don't think. There was a lot of resistance in the neighborhood, that not in my backyard syndrome. So we had to, we did a lot of work to get the neighborhood to be our friends. And some of them, one time they actually picketed our house. And another time I was in a meeting and somebody actually threatened me and said, that you will never be safe in this neighborhood. But in the end, they kind of loved us. And I think this happened to the Soteria in San Jose. I don't know what happens in Vermont, and maybe Jean can speak to that. But in terms of safety concerns, there's a term that the Soteria people use called being with. And you just be with people. In the state hospital, they would call it a one-to-one, but it was more of like watching. But a Soteria house, it's truly being with, just joining with the person, being with, and just being aware to help them be safe out in the community. We didn't lock them up. So I remember walking in the middle of the night with the guy because he decided he was going to walk home, which was pretty far away, and it was like 10 degrees out. And I thought I was going to die in the cold. And I finally so the difference would be in a conventional system, somebody would call and haul him off, right? This is not safe. He's gravely disabled. Instead, I said, I'm really old and I'm cold. Could we please go back home? I just appealed to a sense of humanity. So I think that's kind of the difference.
Yeah, I'll come in here too. I think that's exactly it. It's again, I'm going back to the relationship of connecting with them as a human being. I have one example at Emanon. So I was the director there. So I came by one weekend just to see how things were going. And everybody was outside. They were all gathered in a group in the backyard with the staff there. And I was kind of confused. What's going on? And they said, whatever, Bob is inside and he's terrorizing everybody. And I was shocked. And I said, what? And he says, yes, he shouldn't. This is one of the staff members was saying, yes, he's just terrorizing everybody, and I brought everybody outside to keep him safe. And he's just in there terrorizing everyone. So this is how you deal with Bob's question of are people really seriously psychotic? And this was a young man that had burned his hair. So top of his head was all scarred, and he was quite scary looking. And he was a big guy. He was bigger than me. But at this point, I thought, he can't be in there by himself. He can't do that. That's not why he's here. So I went inside in the living room in the rocking chair, rocking back and forth, just very intensely rocking back and forth. And I was scared, and I thought, holy crap, what's happening here? So I went in and I sat down in the chair next to him, and I just sat there as he rocked back and forth for about 2 minutes or so, and I'm just assessing how I felt. I needed to know what was going on with me. And finally, I just said to him, man, it is really scary in this room. And he just stopped, and he turned and he looked at me and says, oh God, do you feel it too? And I said, yes. And he just relaxed. And he said, I thought it was just me. I have been terrified in here by myself this whole time. And we just started talking, and we had a wonderful conversation. And it went on. And eventually he wanted to go to the whole end of the story is he wanted to go back to Hawaii, where his family was, and his mother would send him a ticket, but he felt ashamed that he didn't have any shoes to go. He couldn't wear any shoes back on the airplane. And so I looked down at my feet, and we were about the same size. And I asked him, what size shoe do you wear? And he said, whatever. And they were mine. And I said, well, try these on. And they were these, you guys aren't from the 70s. You don't remember Earth shoes, but they were called Earth shoes. And the heel was lower than the front. And they were bizarre little shoes. But he tried my shoes on, and they fit. And I said, Bob, they're yours. And he was just, I thought it was wonderful. And he contacted his mother, and within 2 weeks, he flew back to Hawaii, feeling much better. And so the whole thing is, I will say it 1,000 times. It's a relationship, establishing a relationship with the person. Don't make them foreign to yourself, because that's what happens when they get picked up. That's how the police see them. That's how the psychiatrist sees them. That's how the ward sees them, as something other than themselves, and they're not being connected with as a human being. And for me, that was it. Just saying to him, my God, it's really scary in this room. It just broke it all down. And thank you.
So I can just circle back to, this is a little redundant to what I already said, but in terms of being written into the legislation, it's stated in the legislation that we're an alternative or preventative to hospitalization, and that we would be utilizing minimal use of antipsychotic medication. So that's how it's actually written into the legislation to be funded. So I think it's actually, I mean, there's some, I think, challenges to some extent being in the larger system of care, but for the most part, it's actually been the most beneficial thing for us. So we're part of Vermont's system of care. Like, we're part of the bed board for Department of Mental Health. So we're considered a place for people to go when they're in first episode psychosis, and we get a lot of referrals through that system. And as part of our intake process, because we're fully funded, we don't need to use diagnostic criteria, and we don't need to bill for services. So our intake process is very collaborative. We have probably 5 to 6 people on our intake team. So we look at each person that's referred to us very intensely and thoughtfully. We don't use diagnostic criteria as part of our determination. And I think it is a bit challenging to find people that might meet our ideal criteria, which would be somebody that has minimal hospitalization history, minimal medication history. I think it's still, even though Soteria is pretty well known, in Vermont, it's still something that people are new to learning about sometimes. We try to do a lot of trainings for the crisis clinicians in the hospital so that they know to refer people to us. But sometimes people do end up in the hospital and then get referred to us. I think that's a larger issue with residentials being seen as a step down from hospitalization. And I think it's kind of radical for people to see a residential program as just an alternative. So we do get a lot of high intensity folks that are in extreme states, and that can really range. We might have somebody that's in an extreme state that just wants to go walk for hours on end in the freezing cold temperatures, and we're trying to make sure that they're well bundled and that we have staff rotating being with, and making sure staff get breaks and staff are feeling okay, and this person is staying safe in the cold. And it might be really, really intense, and it might be intense in different ways. Sometimes we have folks that are struggling to leave their room, right? They might be in bed in an intense place for a week, and we might be bringing them food and trying to support them. So we definitely are supporting people that are in very intense places, but I just want to say the intensity can look very outward or very inward. We're also known, I think, in Vermont as probably having the highest threshold in terms of residentials for property destruction. So I actually have created a scale of property destruction, and it gives the staff a guideline by which to follow of at what point do we do something different? At what point do we try to shift the experience? We actually have a line item in our budget for property destruction because it is so much a part of what we want to support people in moving through in this program. And it can be really costly. And, property destruction might even look like somebody trying to repeatedly put non-flushable things in the toilet, and our toilets overflowing, right? Which has actually caused quite a lot of damage over the years. But that's just, I think, worth noting, just in terms of giving you a flavor of how intense it gets there, that we have a budget line item for property destruction.
So we have a lot of great questions popping up, a lot of sort of how-to technical questions, but I got one more question for y'all before we get to these. In what way is it rewarding to work in a Soteria house? Personally rewarding? How does it change you? I mean, and compare that to a staff member in a hospital where medications are the norm, that sort of thing. So can you speak to the experience for you all, not just how you did it, but how does it change you? Is it a worthwhile thing? Is it a existentially worthwhile thing? You're being with is a relationship. It goes two ways. Both, it's not just one side that's getting affected, so is the other side. So can you just speak to the experience of working in a Soteria house, how it changes you, and is it
I,
worthwhile?
I, my first job, because in the 70s, when I got out of college with a bachelor's in psychology, it's like, what do you do with that, right? So I became a psych tech in the state hospital. And I only had to be there 3 days before I said, if I ever get the opportunity to do the other thing, because I knew there had to be something else, I didn't know what it was. I said, I'm going to do it. And thank God the state of Alaska gave me that opportunity many, many years later. But I can tell you this, I have never worked, I'm going to cry when I say this, with a finer group of people in my life as those at Soteria, because it's very special people who can do the kind of things Katie was talking about and not blame the person, understanding. I mean, we had this gal one time who made vaginal soup in our best pot in the world. It's like she poured all kinds of junk out of the kitchen the bathroom cabinets. We don't even know what was in there. And but it's just like, okay, but we're probably not going to serve this for dinner, but it's okay that you made it. But it's the finest group of people I've ever met, really and truly. They just they are able to look into themselves and pull out just, I keep using the term because it's just being with people and not doing two. And that's how Lauren Mosher described it. He said, we're not doing two, we're just being with. And the truth of the matter is, people get better. They walk through this experience, however you look at it, and they get better.
I agree. So Bob, I wrote down like 4 points I wanted to make at some point during this webinar, and I'm just going to read number 4 to you because it answers your question. So it says, finally, I would like to mention something that is implicit in the Soteria model, but is seldom stated outright. That is the high level of affection felt and expressed at the house. Well, I'm having a hard time reading this. I'm not referring to sexual attraction, but rather the open affection of friendship and camaraderie between the active participants at Soteria. Even now, more than 50 years later, I still recall with a warm fondness how much I liked virtually all the people I came to know at Soteria. And that was it. It was this serious, deep affection you had for each other, and it crossed all the lines: staff to residents to volunteers, staff to staff, resident to resident. It was just permissible, and I'll put it in the context of about 10 years ago, or maybe 14. I was working at a program in Vermont, of all places, Katie, actually it was in Massachusetts, and I was suspended twice because I touched a resident, touched them. One was helping, and she was an older lady having a hard time walking the driveway, and so I had her hold my hand as she walked up and down the driveway practicing walking, and I was reprimanded for that. The other time, I was working with another resident. These are all people that had been in this facility for upwards of 30 years. They were chronic. They were here for the rest of their lives. And so I was working with another man about in his 50s, and it was his job to take out the garbage cans on Wednesday night or whatever. So and I would take them out with him. We'd take them from the back down to the curb. And I went to get him, and he wouldn't come. He was in the office, and he's messing around with things in the office. So I went and I took his hand, and I said, Bert, come on now. We got to go bring out the cans. And he went with me. We took him out. Nothing happened. 2 hours later, the director of the program came and told me that I had to leave the facility because it had just been reported to her that I had touched a resident. and I was suspended pending investigation. And so that, and like I think it was Susan said, these are different times, and they are different times. My gosh, the things we could do. We had massage workshops. I had one experience where I think I was told this in the last meeting we got together. I simply played this caveman where I picked up one of the residents, threw over my shoulder, and was carrying her around the house like a caveman, and some of the staff and the other female residents all were fighting me to get her back and trying to save her. And that went on for at least 30 minutes. And it was this wonderful game we all had. But if it were done today, I would have probably been thrown in jail, for crying out loud. And there it was just a game, a way of interacting with each other. And there was no underlying messages other than this. This was women who were fighting for other women. The underlying psychodynamics of it was incredible. And we were aware of it at the time. I knew what I was doing at the time. They knew what was happening at the time. They knew it was a psychodrama we were playing out without anybody stating it. And so those kinds of things took place in the 70s that I doubt you could do now at all.
Katie, do you want to weigh in on this? And then I really will be taking some questions that are coming up. There's some really good questions that are coming up. Thanks, Gina and Susan. That was great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could just speak to my own kind of personal experience of how I showed up to this work. I wish Soteria had existed for me, which is why I've stayed involved for so long and why I've been so passionate about this. I was put on a lot of psychiatric medication when I was in college, and I would just say I think psychiatric medication can be a tool for many people. So I'm not being critical of that as a tool for some folks. For me, it was really harmful to be on psychiatric medication, including antipsychotics. And what's really fascinating is that I was on some type of medication for like over 10 years. I was only on antipsychotics very briefly, but I actually came fully off psychiatric medication as the director of Soteria. So I'm really proud of that for myself personally. And I think it just speaks to how much I was also showing up as a person, still kind of going through this living experience in some way. We talk a lot about lived experience, but I also think it's really important to acknowledge like living experience. Like some of this doesn't always like fully leave us. And, I think a lot of the staff, we don't require staff to have to identify fully with like an array of lived experiences, but most of them do. And I think that that's what makes this community just so beautiful is how everyone's showing up with their lived experiences. Al, you mentioned earlier about like a clinical director. We don't have a clinical director. We have me and we have peer support and we have a contracted psychiatrist. But we don't have a medical director that's like making any overhead calls for us. I'm grateful we have that contract and that we can consult with somebody if a resident wants us to, but we're really as peer-led as we can possibly be. So I'm really proud of that.
Great. Thanks, Kate.
I'll real quick. Katie, you just pointed to something that is one of the big differences between 1970 now, and that is you aim to get what we used to call neuroleptically naive people who weren't on medication, and they're almost non-existent because most of these programs end up being funded for adults. It has to do with funding sometimes, and kids are getting put on medication at a very young age. And so and for the Soteria, New Mexico, we do have a consulting psychiatrist, and he just bangs this home to me all the time. You have to pay attention to this. People are going to come to you on medication, but they're going to want to get off. And it can be a very long process. You said you did it while you were the director of Soteria. I think that's beautiful, actually. But it's, so anybody starting a program, this has to be included as part of an expectation anymore, because that's who we're seeing, whether or not they've been in hospital.
Okay. I got a question directed at Al. By the way, we're listening to y'all. Pesach Lichtenberg, who was the psychiatrist that helped start Soteria Israel's, he told me he's never had so much fun as a psychiatrist as working in a Soteria place compared to a hospital. It was a totally different experience. Al, we just going to move forward sort of towards the idea of like, why did they disappear? And now, replication possibilities and funding possibilities. But there is some people taking a bit of issue with your question of why Soteria was shut down after 12 years. You had this reports that were successful. And so the question is, if you can expand on why you think it was shut down. And I'm just going to read, there's a really interesting question if I can find it here, and I'll just read it to you because it's someone with some personal experience. Hold on, sorry about this. There's quite a few number of questions. Here it is. It says, I'm a tenured professor in Michigan who experienced psychosis in my late 20s, so have a great interest in this topic. I also have been a principal investigator and reviewer for NIH research projects over years, so I'm well familiar with how this organization works. While much that Al Galves said was terrific, I dispute his conclusion that there was some conspiracy to shut it down. Mr. Galves stated, instead of replicating it, seeing maybe other versions tried out, trying larger numbers, maybe even at a hospital mule, the NIMH shut it down. They buried the data. He then said, the reason I know they buried the data is because you met with the women in charge of schizophrenia research at NIMH in 2010. I take issue with the NIMH conspiracy claim because there are many reasons why NIMH might have discontinued a project and why a particular person at NIMH might not have heard of it. So can you expand on your thought? I believe we need to have questions that, that ask difficult questions. So here's one. Can you just expand on why you think it was shut down, Al?
Yeah, I think it was shut down because psychiatry wasn't going in that direction. Psychiatry was not interested in psychosocial approaches. Psychiatry was going towards the medical model, all in. We're only going to pay attention to things we can quantify, we can see on a brain scan, we can measure in a laboratory. We are going to use materialistic science. We're going to base our work on materialistic science. And I think that's really what happened. And, shortly after that, Loren Mosher wrote an amazing letter where he resigned from the American Psychiatric Association and said he was doing it because this has become the American Psychiatric Pharmaceutical Corporation Association. So I think that's what happened. And in fact, what has happened is the National Institute of Mental Health has been taken over by neuroscientists, totally taken over by neuroscientists. And they're studying the brain. Now, what good is it going to do to human beings to study the brain? Human beings don't use the brain to live their lives. They use their minds to live their lives. And the brain is not the same thing as the mind. And neuroscientists have no idea about the relationship between the brain and the mind. So the NIMH is wasting tremendous amounts of money. I just finished doing a study of the NIMH. The NIMH spend $2.3 billion a year, 9 zeros. And they are the federal agency responsible for contributing to the mental health of Americans. 75% of that money is spent on studying the brain and genetics, 5% on psychotherapy. So what's happened, the answer to the question is that the NIMH has been taken over by neuroscientists, and psychiatry has been taken over by the medical model. And that's what's happened.
Yeah, I will say to add, Al, when I spoke to Loren Mosher about this many, many years ago, he said, look at what Soteria did at this time. It deprofessionalized the whole thing, right? So it sort of turned things out of the hospital. And also, this was at a time, when drugs were seeing, what did psychiatrists do? They prescribed drugs. That was what they did. And all of a sudden, here was this program that's saying maybe you should be using them in a very different model, or maybe they're actually causing harm. So it was such a threat to a larger system of care.
Oh, yeah. And this is one of the problems, is it's so low tech. I can imagine talking to a psychiatrist and I'm saying, well, I don't think the drugs are really so good. I mean, they may help people in some ways. They may knock down the symptoms, but look at the long-term side effects of the drugs. And, they take the vitality out of people. And the psychiatrist then says to me, well, what do you suggest? I say, I suggest the Soteria House. I suggest a place where you provide safety, support, and affirmation to people as they go through the psychotic experience. And he's going to say, I didn't go to med school for that. That's not what I went to med school for.
I think that's what you need to see, that this was quite a challenge to a whole existing system.
Yeah.
It was
Deprofessionalizing. Go
also
ahead, Gene.
the way it took place. I mean, you can get taken away with conspiracy theories, but in fact, back in the 70s and the 80s, when Soteria, the research was showing this tremendous success, and it was significant on every level, that Big Pharma started funding people to do research to prove that it wasn't successful. And we still cooperated with that. And when they failed at that, just the very way that the Center for the Study of Schizophrenic Research was taking place was Lauren went to Europe to give some talks. Well, and to Europe on the Soteria project, and I'm working with this. While he was gone, without a phone call even, NIMH defunded the entire Center for the Study of Research of Schizophrenia. So when he came back and got off the plane, he found he was out of a job and he was out of a position. The center that he ran for whatever it was 10 years no longer even existed in the way they did it when he was out of the 1 week notice or anything. It was just gone when he returned. To say that that was just a random act is BS. It was clearly meant to stop this procedure. And like Bob and Al have been saying, it also was a threat to psychiatry. I mean, nobody had degrees. Nobody were licensed people. This was just, I have a BA in psychology. Other people had BAs in English. Other people who hadn't even graduated from college, and they were doing stuff that trained psychiatrists couldn't do, and that made a huge difference.
Yeah,
So
that was part of the depersonalization, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I should also say just briefly that even during the project, because they were doing the research, and Gene, you know this better than I do. They were doing research during the project, and there were a couple of iterations of the research because randomization was difficult. True randomization, because you didn't have an opening at Soteria. Maybe at the time the randomized person was going to go Soteria, so there was some, not quite total randomization. And at NIMH, there were people who were fighting it, who were saying, "No, this isn't good research. No, there's big problems with this research," even though while it was going on, that was happening.
Yes. That's why Emanon was started. The initial studies showed that it was Soteria was tremendously successful, and their first response was, "You got lucky. You have just the right combination of people and residents and staff, and that's why it worked. Can this be replicated?" And that's why we did Emanon. And damned if it wasn't replicated again.
So going forward with this in terms of questions, and we're going to see the movie in just a bit. There's a couple questions here, basically practical questions. The first thing is, by the way, I think this is what's so interesting about Vermont. You were part of the system. You weren't actually outside the system. But the first thing is time. How long do people need to stay, and what are the discharge, who gets discharged from Soteria, and how long do they need to be there? Because of course we know if we talk about costs, they're going to say, oh, you can stay somewhere 6 days, 12 days. So can you talk about how long people can stay at these houses? How long do they need to stay at these houses? And how do people leave Soteria? And then we'll talk about replication in a second.
I can speak to how it happened in Alaska. And so, and this is one of the differences between, I think, peer respites and Soteria houses. The actual approach is pretty similar in terms of being with people, using relationship, but there was no artificial leaving date or discharge date, if you will, and people stayed longer than they probably needed to be there based on their experience, or if you want to use the medical symptomatology, they probably didn't need to be there. But we wouldn't help somebody. We help people leave to go to homes. We almost never discharge people to the street. This happens all the time in many other types of facilities. It's like time to go, and they go to the street. We helped people either go back to their family or their place of choice. Some of them wanted to go back to their family. Some wanted their own apartment. A couple of them got apartments together, but the biggest to me, the biggest barrier, two challenges: the medication withdrawal nowadays, because that wasn't really as big an issue, I think, in the original Soteria. But the other is the housing crisis. People cannot afford to find, acceptable housing anymore. So, but we wouldn't just discharge them to the street. We'd just help people find a place to be. And that's why our Choices program companion program was so important, because when somebody left, they could still get support. And that was peer run from a peer in the community. So it was kind of a nice transition, and make sure that they were in, decent, acceptable housing.
So in Vermont, our average length of, our target is 3 to 6 months for somebody to be in the program, but our average length of stay we found to be around 5 months. For our grant with the Department of Mental Health, though, folks can stay there for up to 18 months, which gives us a window to work with folks if they're, still not kind of moving through the process and that kind of target time frame. We've had a few residents stay for up to a year while we're working on trying to transition them to like other services. Depending on where funding's at any given time in the state, we have been able to do some referrals through like our Housing First program. And we've been able to get people subsidies through the Department of Mental Health to house them in the community. But we also, like as part of our intake process, ask that people have an emergency housing contact. That doesn't always work out. Sometimes somebody has one coming in, but it changes. But housing is a huge issue, although we try to like have a backup plan even as soon as intake for that, because it's such an issue. But we've found our average length of stay to be 5 months. I also just want to speak to one other thing, because Ali, you were mentioning earlier the word kind of stability, like when somebody gets stable in the program. And I know the original model kind of had this structure of like kind of when people move to like employment. And I think what we found at Soteria is that it's not that linear. I'm actually working on this really robust document right now. I'm not sure it's ever going to feel like a living document, because it seems like it's a tough topic to talk about, but we're trying to find like the phases of like non-consensus reality or psychosis and like how that works for somebody's stay. So I'll just share that we've tried to identify like 3 phases. Phase 1 is understanding the experience. Phase 2 is exploring the experience, and phase 3 is integrating the experience. And I think thinking of it in those phases has been really helpful for us, because sometimes we have somebody come into the program that's hearing voices but has a job, right? Like they might actually be, quote, I don't use the word stability, but they might be like seen socially in that way, but still be really struggling. So I wanted to name that because I think it's felt not as linear as you might expect it to.
So just a couple more questions. I got one here from Peter Stasny. I think many of you know who Peter is. And his question is this, and it really goes this. So we've been talking about these small houses. Gene, how many people were at the original Soteria house or Emanon at any one time?
Soteria was 6 max generally, and Emanon, I believe, Emanon was 6, and I think Galves was also 6. It might have been 8, but no more than 8.
Because there is a question here: is how important is the fact that these were small places? Okay, in other words, how important is that? And here's the question from Peter, which I think, if you're talking about sort of systemic change, is obviously so key. How can you replicate this and make it available to many people if people can stay as long as they want? So it's sort of a resource allocation question.
Well, I'll do the size one. Yeah. If it gets too large, then I think you're having conflicts with the relationship. The whole point is, can you get these personal relationship status established? And I'm not talking doctor to patient or nurse to patient. I'm talking about human to human. And if the group is too large, that's just going to inhibit it. So I think that's the only inhibiting factor on that.
So the question then, Gene, that I think is being raised here is, many would agree with what you said, 6, 8, that sort of thing, because the human relationships. But then how do you scale this up so you can have this can be the standard of care or the norm of care?
I think the answer to that I think the answer is you have to have a lot of Soteria houses. I mean, you have to have a lot of Soteria houses, thousands of Soteria houses. You know, and Medicaid spends billions of dollars on the conventional treatment. It's not like there's not money being spent on treating people experiencing extreme states, psychosis, if you want to call it. That money could be used, a lot of that money could be used to create a lot of Soteria houses. This is one of the obstacles to making it happen. Peter's question is one of the obstacles. I'll just tell you, in Doñana County, in 2019, there were 1,200 people. 1,200 people presented to emergency rooms with a diagnosis of schizophrenia spectrum. Well, in the best of worlds, our Soteria house is going to treat maybe 25 people a year. So in that sense, it's a drop in the bucket. But if you can increase the recovery rate to 65, 70%, you're making a big difference. You're really putting a dent in the revolving door. People going from the street to the hospital, to the group home, to the street, to maybe to jail, put a dent in that. And you're saving society a lot of money, because the cost to society of a person at age 25 diagnosed with schizophrenia who doesn't recover is $3.8 million over a lifetime. $3.8 million. So there's a lot of savings to society. Problem is that doesn't accrue to any one institution, right? Yeah. So, but Peter's question is really a good question. That's the question that the people who run the systems are going to ask. Right. This seems like a lot of money for only a few people.
Right. Yeah. But just Al, I think what you need to make the case is it's actually cost efficient. It's cost effective over the long term.
Over the long term, it's cost effective.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, the program I worked at in Central Mass, those people had entered the mental health system around the same time I did, back in the 70s. And here I was back in 2012, and they were, we had 8 people in the house, all on medications. 2 of them court ordered, had to go get injections because they refused to cooperate, and no one was younger than 40 years old. And so that was their life. And so that cost efficiency is what it's all about, for sure. But human beings is what it's also about.
Right. But one of the point is the different recovery rates. And I think that maybe James Moore has put this in the chat room. The people that were working and off medication 2 years later in the Soteria group I think it was the majority of people. And right. Obviously,
majority were never even
a lot of money if you turn this from a chronic disorder into an episodic disorder. That is a big savings. Last question before we go to the movie. There's been several sort of on this. How do you see, is there a similarity between Soteria approaches and open dialogue approaches? Because open dialogue has been getting a lot of attention. So can anybody speak about that? Can there be an overlap? Are they very different? What ways are there similarity? This question has come up a number of times in the Q&A.
So I had the opportunity to be at a conference in Helsinki, and I met in person one of my heroes, Jaakko Sekula, the guy who did open dialogue. And I asked him about what did he think about open dialogue and Soteria, were they competing? And he said in the system that I would envision, you'd have them both. And they're not exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive. So open dialogue, and even though, we weren't totally trained on open dialogue, but we were aware of it in Soteria Alaska. And unlike, I think, the original, as Gene could speak better than that, but I think we incorporated family. So Anchorage is a very diverse city. So the house, the famous question everybody asks me is, what's the program? And I say, well, it's actually no program. It's whoever. And funders don't like that. It's like, it's no program. They're like, what? But the house takes on the flavor of who lives there. So at one time we had this guy steeped in Filipino culture, because large Filipino community. And his family used to come over like once a week and make dinner with all the residents, a Filipino dinner. And then we had another person who was a Mexican American, and he had family that was really involved. And some programs would like cut off the family. We invited them in, and they do the same thing. So a lot happens around meals. I don't know how else to explain it. I say meals over meds these days. So, but yeah.
Yeah, I would also say, like, I see that Jim Gotzing had been mentioning open dialogue, and I would trust Jim on anything, so I would go with that. But also within Soteria, it's not dogmatic. It's not like this is the way it has to be. The whole point is it's phenomenological, so it accepts what's happening at that moment. So if someone comes in and is well versed in open dialogue and wants to try it, I don't, even in the old Soteria house, that wouldn't have been taboo. It would have been, are people open to it? Do you want to do this? And if you want to give it a try, go for it. But I wouldn't bring a dogmatic rule in that we have to do Freudian psychology and that's all that's going to count, or we have to do Jungian and that's all that's going to count. But being open to anything is what it was all about. And I think all these programs, that's what it's about. Like, what works? Let's try to find anything that will help the person that we're working with.
So
Katie, any thoughts on this? And then go to the
yeah, so in Vermont, we actually have the collaborative network approach, which is a whole kind of movement for open dialogue to be brought to all the designated agencies in Vermont. So a number of our staff have been trained in open dialogue. I've gone to a few trainings about open dialogue. We've had some residents over time like go outside of Soteria and do open dialogue more formally. And I think for the sake of time, I won't kind of go into all the kind of nuances of it, but we do incorporate, I think, some of the concepts, but we don't call it open dialogue. Everybody's trained in intentional peer support. We do network meetings every single week with the residents. And in that network meeting, it's similar in the sense that people can invite whomever they want to that meeting. But we don't do the formal open dialogue process where like you have two people kind of talking to each other and reflecting about the quote, like person of concern. Like we don't do that kind of formal process of open dialogue.
Katie, I'm going to move to Vermont.
Yeah,
Well, Bob,
please do.
We've thought about adding the possibility of doing open dialogue with the families of residents in the Soteria house as a possible option. And I think there's some real similarities between the two approaches. One is that both approaches are invoking the self-healing properties of human beings. They're really facilitating the self-healing properties of human beings. Both approaches use relationship, essentially, use relationship community as the modality of treatment, and both of them don't use psychiatric drugs as the primary modality of treatment. So there are some real similarities between those two approaches, and the possible putting them together.
So we're going to, Al, if you want to, in 1 second, share your screen. I just want to say this was a very inspiring discussion because it's so optimistic. Instead of the usual sort of pessimism around this whole subject, it's so optimistic. And it's such a reminder that human beings need each other and that everyone needs each other. Sorry, I sort of got something in my throat. All right, Al, over to you. Okay, everyone. Sorry about the quality of that. We had some problems before we were going, just in terms of the broadcasting this. James put in the chat a link to where you can watch this video on YouTube. But I think you got the gist of it. People feel like this was a chance for the human relationships, not being treated like a broken person. It was a path to recovery. That's the message from this really pretty brilliant 10-minute movie. So please go on to YouTube. You can watch it directly there. I think in the time we have left, we really want to focus now on, what are the possibilities of actually starting a Soteria project? How can we see these replicated and grow? And so Al and Susan, maybe you can talk about where you're at with your, efforts in Las Cruces, New Mexico.
Yeah, well, we've made some pretty good progress, and it's taken us a long time. I think we've been at it for about 4 years now. Um, and I think the key to it, Bob and Susan can talk about this. The key to it is really enrolling people in the idea and getting support for it. And we started by getting a group together in Las Cruces, a group of people who could see the value of it, wanted to have it here as an option. Many of them people whose family members had experienced psychosis and been treated by the conventional system and not done well. And you know what we've learned is that when you tell people about Soteria, especially if they've had experience with it in their family or with themselves, they get it pretty quickly. The idea that, you know, wow, there could be a place where a person could be helped to go through the experience makes a lot of sense to them. And so building a network and enrolling people, and that process for us involved a number of things. One thing is we have a local behavioral health collaborative here. It's a group of people in the behavioral health system and elected officials who care about behavioral health. And that collaborative put together a strategic plan. And we got involved in that. And we had Soteria actually named as a game-changing strategy as supportive housing. Basically, we sold it as supportive housing, as a form of supportive housing. So it's really a treatment. I consider it a treatment for schizophrenia. And then, you know, we would, every chance we had, we would talk to legislators. Our legislation only meets for 30 days, 1 year, and 60 days the next. But in the summers, all of the committees have interim meetings. And we would go to the meetings of the interim Human Services, Health and Human Services Committee, talk about Soteria. We would go to the meetings of the interim Legislative Finance Committee and talk about Soteria. And we also began to get support. We had support in the legislature. We didn't have support in the executive. And we needed to get that. So we started meeting with some of the people who run the agency that provides behavioral health in New Mexico. We were lucky that the man who directs the Legislative Finance Committee happens to be a man I know, and he got the idea of Soteria, and he could then support it from the executive branch part. So I can tell you that, and by the way, one of the members of our group in Las Cruces is a state representative, and that is big. And also the chair of the House Appropriations Committee is a young man who lives in Las Cruces. So, and we've had people talking to him, you know, city councilors and county commissioners and the director of the County Health and Human Services Committee and the mayor. And so that's what it takes. It takes talking to people, enrolling people in the idea. And I can tell you that just the other day, about 5 days ago, Soteria was put into the budget, $1.5 million for the first 2 years. It's in the budget, in the legislative budget, and unless somebody takes it out in a line item veto, it will pass. It will be signed by the governor, and we will have money starting July 1st to create our Soteria house. Yeah, so I think, and let me just say one thing. Why do we go to the state? Why do we go to the state? Well, both of the Soteria houses that have operated in the United States since the original have been funded by the state. Soteria Alaska was funded largely by the state. Now, Susan can tell you they have a mental health authority that no other state has that made a difference. As Katie said, Soteria Alaska has been funded totally by the state legislature for 9 years now, 10 years, $1 million a year. And so it seems like the state, since most states are responsible for behavioral health, that's sort of a place to go. Anyway, Susan.
Okay, I'm going to be philosophical. There's a group of indigenous people in Mexico called the Tarahumarans, and they live up in this canyon, and they're long distance runners, and they run 100 miles at a clip just for the heck of it. And if you ask them, how do you do that? I used to run 100 miles. I can't even fathom it. And if you say, how do you do that? And they will say to you, as they have said to me, you put one foot in front of the other. And and in some ways, this speaks to Peter's question. You can't bring it to scale immediately, but if you put one foot in front of the other, and we have Soteria Vermont. If we can get Soteria Las Cruces again going, just one foot in front of the other, and then people will begin to hear about it and say, holy cow, this is a good idea. Let's do some funding shifting here. And I forgot the original question because I decided to go with the Tarahumarans on this one. But but in truth, it is a good idea. The other thing is not the best idea because let's face it, as Elle always points out, it's not working. So we need something else. If it was working, why would we do something else? It's not working. It's as simple as that. But it's very complicated because the funding, wherever you get your funding, there's always strings attached. I don't care if it's a rich person who writes you a check. They'll have some ideas about what this should look like. If it's a state, the state will have challenges or confines based on their funding streams. And so there's always that. And then it's a matter of mitigating it and staying true to the model. And people ask, why did Soteria Alaska close? And the assumption has been made that the state closed it down, but the state did not close it down. And they got it in the legislature like in perpetuity until somebody took it out, but that's not what happened. So the one thing I want to caution people who are starting this up is pay attention to your boards and the people who are making your decisions, your executive directors, your boards, and make sure they are really true to the model and that they or the approach. I don't like to call it a model because it looks different everywhere, but the approach, make sure they're true to the approach. And because if an organization, a not-for-profit, this is true of any not-for-profit, if you lose your purpose and your mission, you're not going to survive. I mean, this is just not-for-profit. My ideas about not-for-profit. You stay true to your mission and your approach. And I don't know if that helps anybody, but that's what I see happens.
Yeah, just one more, because I noticed in the chat, somebody said, wow, yeah, the system isn't working. Conventional treatment doesn't work very well. Recovery rate is less than 20%, maybe even less than that. Bob might have a better idea about what the true recovery rate is for recovery. And many, many people, as you all know, get turned into chronic mental patients. Once they get into the conventional system, it's a high probability they're going to become chronic mental patients. So it's not working. The system is not working very well. We need some other options.
Katie, you want to jump in here? Anything about how to get one started?
I think it's tricky. I think that we are very, very lucky, like we already mentioned, just that we're already fully funded by the Department of Mental Health. I mean, I think you could also, I know for our peer respite, which we just funded in the fall, that was actually funded by a foundation. So, I don't know if it's worth looking into foundation funding. Another thing to consider that I don't know if how applicable this is to certain places, but the peer respite we opened is a 2-bed peer respite because you don't need to do the same licensing requirements. So if we eventually expand and get more funding, we might look into licensing, but that's something to maybe consider too in terms of how you're getting your funding and then also the licensing piece. I think it's if it's 3 folks you're serving or more, you have to get licensed a certain way. So
listen, I want to thank everybody for coming today, everybody in the audience and panelists, and Al for setting this up. We're sort of coming to the end of the time here. First of all, I found this very inspiring, but also very important, because what we're talking about is how do we change the system? Al, you said, what is the recovery rate? There was a study looking at long-term recovery rates for people diagnosed with schizophrenia in the US and Western countries that was published, I think, in 2008 or something. It's now the worst it's ever been. It's lower than it was in the first third of the 20th century. It was a 6% recovery rate. If you see about recovery actually going back when functioning and that sort of thing. So that's a statistic of a broken system. That's not working for the society, for anybody. I was really struck though when we were talking about how you get one started. Al, you spoke about relationships. Politics are relationships too. You've got to build relationships with the people who have a chance to control the budget, et cetera. And there is an argument to be made here. I think all of you have talked about the argument that can be made here, but you have to make it to people. I think the other important thing is get families involved, because families live with the broken system. I have to say, there were so many important questions here. I wish we would have had time to address them all. There were questions, first of all, about safety of workers, which is obviously a big question. There was questions about rules about substance abuse, which are good questions. There were questions about the demographics of it. Now, Vermont is, let's be honest, a pretty white state. New Mexico, not so much so. So I think one of the questions is that people are asking, can this be available to, people across the diverse spectrum of people that it can be?
Alaska was very diverse, by the way, because Anchorage, because of the military presence, has a huge diverse population. So,
and I think that's
also,
go ahead.
When I worked at Phoenix programs, we had a house in Richmond that was called Niumbachuki that was specifically for African Americans. We had a house in San Pablo that was called Casa Cecilia G that was strictly for Latinos. And the same principles applied, but you applied it to the human beings again. So the culture changed in each of those houses, but it was the exact same principles and concepts. And I just want to throw in one last thing, and then I'll shut up forever. In terms of how do you make one? You keep talking to people, you keep trying, and then what I fall back on is Samuel Beckett's wonderful quote of try, fail, try again, fail better. So you just keep on going. And that's what you do. Like Susan said, keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah. And I encourage people, I encourage everybody on this webinar to do it. Get together with some people, start creating one in your community.
Just talk about it. Yeah.
If I can help you, I did put my email in the chat early on in the chat, agalves2003@comcast.net. I think I would love to help if I can. I know Susan would. I know Jean would. I'm Katie would too. Katie's pretty busy. She's managing not just Soteria, but also the peer run respite. I think probably some other things also. But I think all of us would love to help you any way we can. You will come. I'll go wherever you are if I can talk to people about it, because I believe this is absolutely the best way to help people who are experiencing psychosis, whatever you want to call it, experiencing extreme states, a connection with the divine, a way of recovering. This is the best way to do it, or other iterations of it. But this basic idea of helping people go through the experience and learn from it. This is about people's lives. And so they can go through the experience, safety, support, affirmation, learn from it, and recover. Yeah.
Susan and Katie, last thoughts?
I will offer as Al has already offered me up. Anybody, I just put my email in the chat. I'm glad to help people walk through this if you're interested in doing it. Jean pointed this out in a meeting we had, that if we treat the whole system and even this group of people the way we would like it to be done in a Soteria type approach, then it is about relationships. It's understanding who your funders are, but not just the organizations, but who are the actual people. I mean, we have some politicians who they didn't get it, but they're starting to get it now. And so I'm very hopeful, and anybody who wants to email me and have a chat about this, I'm glad to do it. And thank you for having us. This is always so much fun for me. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to say thanks to Bob and Zoe and James. You did it a couple of years ago with the Soteria Respite Summit, and you're doing it again today. And I just really appreciate what you guys do.
Thanks, Gene.
Yeah,
Katie?
me too. Yeah.
Yeah, just thank you so much. I'm really grateful that the conversation's happening. And I just saw a lot of like Soteria Vermont love in the chat. So that was just really lovely to see. Thank you all for being here today. I put my email in the chat also, so folks can feel free to email me. Just so that you know, we do have a training institute at Pathways Vermont. So we do a lot of trainings, and we actually have a very robust, I think it's like 4 to 5 hour training about Soteria and our model and how we implement it. And if folks are interested in reaching out, even just to get one of those trainings, I can also just direct you to our training institute.
Great. Well, thanks for this great panel, great discussion. I want to thank for everyone being here. I can't tell you how important the interaction is with the audience, or just the community here. That's one of the ways that everybody learns as well, and you have this sense of a shared mission and a shared interest. So thanks everyone for coming. Real quickly, I think you all know that Mad in America, we publish regularly on such issues. We have a newsletter, so sign up for our newsletter. We do have support groups, online support groups for basically for family members. Obviously the peers have many support groups, but sometimes the family members who especially break with the conventional narrative, they feel left out. So we do have support groups for family members. You can follow us on social media, mostly Facebook. I know almost nothing about social media, but I know we're getting involved on Instagram and Reddit forums as well, trying to sort of help foster a new narrative out there. I want to thank everyone who purchased a ticket today, which helps make these events possible. They help cover our costs for running them. So, and we rely exclusively on donations to fund Mad in America. So if you have a few dollars, thank you very much. And finally, in terms of the webinar events, if you become a subscriber to Mad in America, which gives you full access to all of our content, most of our content is already easily accessible. A monthly donation is $5 a month. A yearly donation is $20, and that gives you free access to all of our events. And finally, this group met earlier, and we talked about how can we follow up on this. And so I think we'll continue to talk about how we can continue to promote and discuss these ideas of Soteria-like projects. Just want to say sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Great questions. The chat will be available. The recording will be available for those who couldn't make it or you want to watch it. And like I say, go to that YouTube to really see the video. That's so inspiring that we had a little bit of trouble with syncing everything up, but it's there on YouTube. And it really encapsulates, by talking to the people, they got their lives back. That's the bottom line. These people got their lives back, and they didn't end up as chronic patients. And that's the possibility here we need to embrace. So thank you all. Oh, and I want to give thanks to Zoe. Jean, thanks for mentioning this. Zoe Kanouf, she's the one who really organized this technologically. Thanks to James Moore for being in the chat. As you all know, James runs our MI radio. So thanks, everyone. Great time. And that's it. Thank you.